the Rebellious Son. When greed destroys family legacy, Fu, a spoiled son of a once noble family, slips further into depravity even after his marriage to the dutiful yet ominous Lone. His parents, who had amassed wealth and goodwill through generous acts, now worry as their son squanders everything on gambling, liquor, and vile behavior. Despite his father's disapproval and attempts to discipline him, Fu is emboldened by his mother's enabling ways and Lone's cold ambition. Soon a conspiracy unfolds when Lone, with a sinister plan to inherit Fu's family fortune, conspires with him to bring about his father's demise. They poison Fu's father, Mr. Fong, causing his untimely death. The crime goes unnoticed, but Fu and Lone's greed seals their fate. Fu's mother, Mrs. Lim, begins to suspect foul play, especially when she learns that her son and daughter-in-law have been careless in hiding their actions. A series of ghostly occurrences plague the household, each one more terrifying than the last. At night, the spirit of Mr. Fong appears before Fu, accusing him of betrayal and condemning him to suffer. Lone's resolve begins to crack as shadows haunt her. Voices call to her from the depths of the well, and chilling apparitions mar her waking and dreaming hours. Haunted by the very people she helped destroy, Lone, along with Fu's new lover Hong, descends into a nightmare that leads them both to the same grisly end. Part 1. A Father's Disappointment. Mr. Fong sat at the large carved wooden table, hands resting heavily on its surface. The dim, flickering light from an oil lamp cast a wavering shadow across his aged face, deepening the lines carved by years of hard work and duty. He had built this house himself, brick by brick, creating a legacy his family could be proud of. Now, at an age when he should have been at peace, content with his achievements, Mr. Fong found himself gripped by an unshakable dread, a dread that coiled tightly around his heart every time he thought of his only son, Fu. Fu was the sole heir to everything Mr. Fong had built over a lifetime. His neighbors, who looked up to him, often said that the Fong family was blessed, both in wealth and in reputation. His wife, Lin, and he had always opened their doors to those in need, sharing what they had. But despite these blessings, Mr. Fong knew his family was cursed, and that curse wore the face of his own flesh and blood. Fu, with a handsome face and an easy charm, had been raised with every opportunity, yet he'd squandered it all. Even as a child, Fu's behavior had worried Mr. Fong. While other children showed their parents respect and obedience, Fu seemed to grow bolder, often indulging in fights with other boys, demanding money for sweets, and even lying to get his way. His mother had tried to excuse his behavior, saying he was simply spirited and would settle down with age. Mr. Fong had tried to believe her, yet a shadow always lingered in his heart. The years passed, but Fu only grew wilder, more defiant. He sought out the seedier parts of town, drawn to the dangerous allure of gambling dens and underground taverns. His reckless habits became the talk of the village. "Did you hear? Mr. Fong's son lost a fortune in one night," they say. Fu was seen stumbling through the streets. Reeking of alcohol, the whispers grew louder, and each one struck Mr. Fong like a dagger. "What's left of my name," he muttered to himself one evening as he sat alone. "What was the point of all this, of everything I built, if he's going to tear it down despite everything?" A faint hope lingered within Mr. Fong. He clung to the belief that perhaps Fu could still change. Maybe a wife could ground him, offer him stability, and guide him away from the vices that had consumed him. So when a respectable young woman named Lone expressed interest in Fu, Mr. Fong felt a spark of relief. Lone was beautiful, sharp, and possessed a quiet strength. Surely a woman like her would be able to reach Fu in ways that Mr. Fong could not. But the relief was short-lived. Lone, he soon realized, was no gentle influence. She was calculated, her movements deliberate, and her words chosen with precision. There was a glint in her eye that unsettled Mr. Fong, but he tried to ignore it, hoping it was merely a trick of the light. After all, she seemed kind enough, and she treated him with respect, though there was an edge to her deference that he couldn't quite place. Fu, however, was oblivious to his father's concerns, entirely smitten by his new wife. Lone seemed to understand him in a way no one else did, encouraging his every whim, indulging his excesses, and whispering promises of power and wealth that made Fu's chest swell with pride. She fueled his worst tendencies, reinforcing the notion that he was entitled to his father's fortune, that he deserved it all without having to work a day in his life. Lone had no patience for Mr. Fong's legacy of integrity and kindness. She wanted the wealth and the influence, and she wanted it without delay. One evening, as Mr. Fong sat with his wife, he voiced his fears. "He has become a stranger to me, Lin. I hardly recognize him anymore," he murmured, his voice thick with sorrow. "And Lone, there's something about her that chills me. I fear she sees us only as obstacles to the fortune." Mrs. Lin shook her head, her eyes softening. "He's young. He'll change. It's only a phase," she said, though her voice wavered slightly. Deep down, she too had seen the darkness in Lone's eyes, the calculated look she threw Mr. Fong's way when she thought no one was watching. But Mrs. Lin had always been a mother first, and as much as she feared for her son, she couldn't bear to believe he was lost to her entirely. As the months passed, Mr. Fong's worst fears were realized. Fu grew bolder, defying his father openly, drinking more, gambling more. He stopped returning home some nights, leaving his parents to worry endlessly. When he did return, he would saunter in drunk and staggering, muttering curses under his breath. And always Lone was at his side, smiling that cold, twisted smile that made Mr. Fong's skin crawl. One night, unable to bear it any longer, Mr. Fong confronted his son. "You are throwing everything away, Fu. Our family name, our honor, do you not care?" Fu merely laughed, the sound sharp and bitter. "Honor," he scoffed. "What good is honor when there's wealth to be had? Maybe that matters to you, but I'm not your old man. This house, this wealth, one day, it will all be mine, and I'll do as I please." The words struck Mr. Fong harder than any blow ever could. He saw the triumph in Lone's eyes, the satisfaction in her smirk, and he realized with a sinking heart that there would be no redemption for his son. He'd raised a boy who would one day be a monster, and it was too late to stop him. The days turned to nights, and nights into restless slumber. Each evening, as Mr. Fong lay in bed, he could feel the weight of despair press upon him like a suffocating blanket. He began to hear things whispers in the hallways, faint but unmistakable. Sometimes he thought he heard his own name being called in a voice that wasn't quite human, a voice that seemed to carry a chill from another world. It felt as though the very walls of the house were closing in, that the years of sacrifice and toil were unraveling, brick by brick, beneath his feet. One particularly dark night, Mr. Fong awoke with a start, drenched in cold sweat. He'd had a dream, a nightmare where he was trapped in his own home, trying to reach Fu, who only laughed and turned away, his form slipping into shadows. In the dream, Lone had been there too, her face twisted into a grotesque sneer as she whispered words that slithered into his mind like poison. It was then that Mr. Fong realized that his home was no longer his sanctuary. The love and legacy he had poured into it were now tainted, poisoned by the presence of his son and daughter-in-law. Fu's ambitions, fueled by Lone's influence, had turned his very blood against him. And for the first time in his life, Mr. Fong felt a chill of genuine fear. Still, Mr. Fong held on to a sliver of hope, however faint. He wished, as any father would, for a miracle, for something to awaken the son he loved, the boy who once looked at him with admiration. But he could feel that hope slipping away, eroded by each defiant word Fu hurled at him, by each cold, calculating glance Lone cast his way. But the house wasn't quiet. It had become a restless, brooding place, as though sensing the tension, the animosity festering within its walls. Shadows seemed to cling to the corners, and the once comforting hum of the evening winds felt like whispers of something ominous. And as Mr. Fong watched his son drift further into darkness, he felt as though he were watching his own death. His wealth and his legacy, the very essence of who he was, were slipping away, and he could do nothing to stop it. His life had been reduced to a hollow echo of what it once was, and he could feel it like a whisper in the dark that it was only a matter of time before this home, this life, would devour him. The curse of his family was not in poverty, not in hardship, but in the heart of his own son, twisted by greed and dark ambition. And in the flickering shadows, Mr. Fong could almost sense the doom that awaited him, a doom that wore the face of his own flesh and blood, his only son. It was as if the walls themselves held a grudge, holding on to secrets, storing the bitter resentment that had replaced love in this house. Mr. Fong felt the weight of it all, a haunting presence pressing down on him. The whispers grew louder, and in his soul he felt the coming storm, one that would consume not just him, but everything he'd ever cherished. Yet he could do nothing but wait. Part 2. A sinister plot. In the dim, oppressive silence of the old family home, Lone paced with quiet fury. She was done with waiting. Months had passed since she married Fu, and the wealth she had dreamed of, the sprawling lands, the golden ornaments, the endless cash remained just out of reach, taunting her from within the iron grip of the one obstacle that stood between her and fortune. Mr. Fong. Lone had tried patience, playing the obedient daughter-in-law, bowing her head and smiling with feigned respect. But every day that passed, she saw Mr. Fong watching her with those cold, suspicious eyes, as if he knew. And perhaps he did, she thought bitterly. There was no hiding her ambition, no point in masking the hunger that had burned in her heart long before she met Fu. It was the reason she had married him in the first place, a reckless, entitled man, but one who would one day inherit unimaginable wealth. All she had to do was wait. Yet Mr. Fong clung stubbornly to life, his strength almost defying time. Lone despised how he moved around the estate with that dignified air, as though he owned every stone, every blade of grass. And in truth he did. Everything she wanted lay beneath his watchful gaze, and she could no longer stand it. One evening, with a quiet, simmering anger, she turned to Fu, who sat slouched over a glass of rice wine, oblivious to her irritation. She had been hinting at it for weeks, but now, with the shadows closing in around them, her whispers turned into something far darker. "Fool," she murmured, her voice soft, yet laced with poison. "How long are you going to let your father control you? Everything he has belongs to you. Or should I say it should belong to you?" Fu glanced at her with a lazy smile, dismissive. "It will, one day. He won't live forever." Her gaze narrowed, her jaw tight. But why wait? She leaned in closer, her fingers brushing his hand, as if her touch alone could ignite the fire she needed from him. "Every day is alive. He insults you, questions your worth. And look at him, he's strong for his age. Do you think he plans on letting go anytime soon?" Fu's brows knitted, a flicker of frustration breaking through his drunken haze. He had spent years under the shadow of his father's judgments, enduring the constant reprimands and comparisons. He didn't need to be reminded. But Lone was relentless. Her voice turned into a hiss, filling his mind with words that dripped like venom, slipping into the cracks of his resentment. "What are we, Fu? Servants in his home, waiting for scraps? He would rather die than hand over his fortune to you. So why should we wait for that? Why don't we take what is rightfully yours?" The thought simmered in his mind, fed by a deep, smoldering rage that Lone stoked with every word. But he hesitated, a flicker of fear glinting in his eyes as he glanced around, as if the shadows themselves might carry his father's wrath. "And how would we do that?" he muttered, his voice low. Lone's lips curled into a sinister smile, her eyes glinting with dark intent. "There are ways, Fu, simple, quiet ways that no one would ever suspect." Her meaning hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Fu swallowed, a bead of sweat trickling down his neck despite the coolness of the night. The realization of what she was suggesting took hold, and for a fleeting moment he was paralyzed. This was no childish rebellion, no act of defiance that would be forgiven. This was murder. Yet, as Lone's gaze bore into him, her unyielding ambition piercing through his hesitation, a terrible excitement filled him. All his life he had waited to seize control, to be more than the shadow of his father. And now here was the answer, dark and tantalizing, handed to him on a silver platter by the woman he trusted most. That night, under the guise of concern for her father-in-law's health, Lone began to prepare. She took careful note of Mr. Fong's routine, noting how he liked his tea in the evening, which herbs he favored for sleep. She'd learned enough from the village healer to know which plants, in small doses, could lead to a quiet, seemingly natural death. The poison she had in mind would weaken him, make his heart strain and falter, and in a few days it would look as if old age had simply caught up with him. The first night of her plan, she crept into the kitchen under the cover of darkness. Fu waited in the shadows, watching her with a mixture of fear and excitement, his pulse racing as she carefully ground the leaves and stirred them into a jar of tea leaves. "Is it?" Safie whispered, glancing nervously at the door. Completely alone, replied, her voice a mere whisper as she sealed the jar. "It will look as if he simply stopped breathing. No one will question it, Fu, not even your mother." She turned to him, her gaze fierce. "Do you understand? Once this starts, there's no going back." Fu nodded, though a chill ran down his spine. The finality of it settled heavily in his chest, but the image of wealth and power, the freedom from his father's suffocating judgment, was too intoxicating to ignore. In the days that followed, Lone poured Mr. Feng's evening tea with delicate hands, her face a mask of dutiful care. She watched as he drank, his weary sighs filling her with a sick satisfaction. Fu, on the other hand, struggled to meet his father's eyes, guilt twisting his stomach with every sip his father took. Yet the more he saw his father weaken, the more he forced himself to believe that he was finally seizing control. It took less than a week for the poison to fully take effect. Mr. Feng, once robust, had become pale and frail, his hands trembling, his breath shallow. Mrs. Ling watched with growing concern, her hands wringing as she prayed for her husband's recovery, unaware that her pleas were in vain. On the fifth night, Lone and Fu waited in their room, their hearts pounding as the final act of their plot unfolded. They listened to the silence, broken only by the faint, labored breaths from the next room. Fu felt his stomach churn as he realized that his father was taking his last breaths, that, with each painful gasp, the power they had dreamed of was within reach. And then the breathing stopped. A silence unlike any other settled over the house, deep and heavy, like a burial shroud. Fu's heart raced and he turned to Lone, whose face was alight with triumph, her lips curving in a smile that sent a shiver down his spine. "It's done," she whispered, her voice barely audible, yet filled with a dark satisfaction. Fu nodded, swallowing hard. He tried to feel relief, to revel in the freedom he had finally gained, but an eerie chill lingered in the room, pressing down on him with a weight that felt almost supernatural. He shook it off, convincing himself it was just nerves, that they were safe. They had gotten away with it, hadn't they? They rose together, slipping quietly from their room and into the hallway. Mrs. Ling was already kneeling by Mr. Feng's bedside, her face streaked with tears, her trembling hand resting on his now still chest. She let out a wail of despair, a sound so raw that it twisted something in Fu's heart, but Lone's grip on his hand was firm, anchoring him to their shared ambition. "Stay calm," she whispered. "We can't let anyone suspect." Fu nodded, though a strange sensation gnawed at him, a sense of foreboding he couldn't shake. Still, they moved forward with cold precision, preparing for the funeral, playing the grieving family. The villagers murmured sympathetically, accepting the tale of Mr. Feng's natural passing without question. After all, he was an old man, they reasoned. His time had simply come. Yet, as they laid Mr. Feng to rest, a sliver of doubt pierced Fu's mind. His father's face, calm in death, seemed to hold a strange expression, almost as if he were watching them still, as if he knew. Fu shivered but brushed it aside, forcing himself to focus on the life that awaited him and Lone, the wealth, the power, the freedom. But as he turned from the grave, he felt something shift in the air, a chill that cut through the warmth of the day, sinking into his bones. He glanced over his shoulder, half expecting to see his father standing there, watching him. "There was nothing. Come on," Lone whispered, tugging his arm. Her voice was bright with anticipation, eager for the new life that lay before them. "It's over," Fu nodded, though his heart felt strangely heavy. Little did he know, the end had only just begun. Part 3. Mother's Suspicion. In the days following Mr. Feng's death, a quiet but unshakable grief settled over the house, like a heavy mist. Mrs. Ling moved through her daily tasks in a daisy, her eyes red-rimmed, her heart hollow. The death of her husband had been sudden, too sudden. Mr. Feng had been ill, yes, but he was a strong man, sturdy and full of life just days before he took his last breath. Now, as she wandered through the empty halls, her steps echoed in the silence, a silence that felt unnatural, almost alive. Mrs. Ling was a woman of simple beliefs. She did not entertain thoughts of ghosts or curses, but in her bones she felt that something was wrong. At first she tried to dismiss the feeling, telling herself that it was merely her grief speaking, her mind grasping at the impossibility of life without him. But strange details began to surface, small, unsettling things that her mind could not ignore. One evening, as she sat alone in the darkened kitchen, she noticed a faint scent of tea, a bitter, herbal smell she didn't recognize. Frowning, she reached for the teapot that had been Mr. Feng's nightly comfort in his final days. There was a residue at the bottom of the pot, a dark stain that felt wrong somehow, though she couldn't explain why. She dismissed it with a sigh, but an uneasy thought lingered in her mind had he been sicker than she realized. Or was there something? More the day stretched on, and whispers began to reach her ears. Neighbors came by to pay their respects, but their condolences often carried subtle hints, strange glances, and half-spoken rumors. She caught phrases like "such a strong man, gone so quickly, and it seems unnatural, doesn't it?" It wasn't long before she began to wonder if others, too, felt the same unease gnawing at her heart. One evening, after the neighbors had left and the household had grown quiet, Mrs. Lin found herself lingering outside her son's room. She could hear Lone's low, measured tones inside, her voice hushed but unmistakable. Curious and instinctively wary, Mrs. Lin leaned closer, her breath shallow as she strained to hear. "Do you think anyone suspects?" Lone's voice was sharp, edged with a tension that sent a chill down Mrs. Lin's spine. Fu's answer was a mutter, almost lost in the thickness of the walls, but Mrs. Lin heard enough to make her blood run cold. "They won't." No one would dare question it. Mrs. Lin stumbled back from the door, her hands trembling. She didn't want to believe what she was hearing, couldn't believe it. But the words stayed with her, echoing in her mind like a dark chant that refused to fade. "They won't. No one would dare question it." Question what? Her mind raced, horror blooming in her chest as she replayed her memories of Mr. Feng's final days. The faint bitterness in the tea. The suddenness of his decline. The way Lone had taken such meticulous care of him, attending to his every need with a strange eagerness that Mrs. Lin now saw in a sinister light. Desperate for answers, Mrs. Lin sought out the village herbalist, an elderly woman named Madame Tu, who was known for her knowledge of ancient remedies and dark law. It was a risky move seeking guidance outside of tradition, but Mrs. Lin's need for the truth outweighed her fear of judgment. When she arrived, Madame Tu's hut was dimly lit, shadows dancing across the walls from the flickering lanterns. Madame Tu herself was a small, wizened woman with eyes that seemed to pierce through flesh and bone. She beckoned Mrs. Ling inside, her gaze unwavering. "You come here with questions heavy in your heart," Madame Tu observed, her voice low and gravelly, as though she already knew what Mrs. Lin sought. Mrs. Ling hesitated, glancing around the hut, filled with jars of dried herbs and mysterious trinkets. Finally she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. I believe something unnatural happened to my husband. He was strong, full of life, and yet..." Her voice broke, and she paused, swallowing hard. "And yet, he's gone." Madame Tu regarded her in silence, a dark glint in her eye. She reached for a small pouch and a bundle of dried herbs, handing them to Mrs. Lin. "Burn these in his room tonight," she instructed. "If his spirit has been disturbed, he will return, and you will know the truth." A chill swept over Mrs. Ling as she took the items, feeling the weight of the unknown pressing upon her. That night, as the house lay silent, she gathered her courage and followed Madame Tu's instructions. She closed Mr. Feng's door behind her and set the herbs alight, watching as a thin tendril of smoke spiraled into the air, filling the room with a hauntingly sweet aroma. For hours she waited in the darkened room, her heart pounding with a mix of dread and hope. Just when she thought nothing would happen, a strange feeling settled over her, like a chill sinking into her bones. The air grew thick, heavy, pressing down on her shoulders until she could hardly breathe. And then a faint voice drifted through the darkness, so soft that she could barely hear it. "Ling." Her breath caught, her eyes widening as she realized that she recognized the voice. "Feng," she whispered, her voice trembling. The air thickened around her, and she could almost feel his presence, cold and distant, yet unmistakably her husband. His voice, filled with a sorrow that tore through her heart, spoke once more, faint but clear. "Betrayal." Poisoned Mrs. Lin's blood ran cold. She clutched her chest, her mind racing, her heart pounding with fear and horror. She had feared as much, but to hear it from his spirit, twisted by the agony of betrayal, was more than she could bear. The realization crashed over her like a tidal wave, and for a moment she could barely stand. Lone. It had to be Lone. She thought of her daughter-in-law's cold, calculating gaze, the way she moved through the house as though it were already hers. And Fu, her own son, twisted by greed and lust for power, willing to let his father die so that he could take what he believed was rightfully his. Overwhelmed by grief and fury, Mrs. Ling stumbled out of the room, clutching at the walls as she made her way down the darkened hall. The knowledge gnawed at her, consuming her from the inside out. She couldn't bear the thought that the man she had loved, the man who had given her a life of peace and security, had been torn from her by the very people she trusted most. But what could she do? The truth weighed heavily on her heart, but she knew that to confront them would be dangerous. Lone was ruthless, and Fu was already too far gone, blinded by ambition. Mrs. Lin was alone, her voice powerless against their greed. But she would not let her husband's death go unanswered. Days passed, but Lin couldn't find peace. Her husband's voice haunted her, echoing in the corners of the house. She thought she saw his figure at night, standing by the doorway, watching her, his eyes filled with silent accusation. The whispers grew louder, filling her dreams, her every waking moment, until she was nearly driven mad with grief and rage. One evening, as she sat alone in the dark, a fierce resolve took hold of her heart. She would find justice, even if it meant summoning forces beyond her understanding. Her husband's spirit deserved peace, and she would see to it that he got it no matter the cost. Her trembling hands lit a candle, and in the dead of night, Mrs. Lin reached out into the darkness with a whispered vow. "I will not let this go, Fong. I will see that you are avenged." And as the candle flickered, she could almost feel the weight of his hand on her shoulder, a silent acknowledgement of her promise. Part 4. Ghostly Revenge. The night was darker than usual, an unnatural thickness filling the air, as if the shadows themselves had weight. Fu lay in bed, tossing and turning, a strange, restless energy coursing through his veins. He tried to convince himself that it was only the strain of recent events, the inheritance, the silent weight of his mother's grief. But as the minutes crawled by, his unease deepened. It felt as if something was watching him, just beyond the door, waiting. He tried to shake the feeling, rolling over and shutting his eyes tight. He whispered under his breath, trying to reassure himself. "It's nothing," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "There's nothing there." But as he lay in silence, he could hear a faint sound, a whisper, like a distant breath carried on the cold night air. He froze, every nerve in his body tense. The whisper grew louder, filling the room with a soft, insistent hiss. His heart began to pound, cold sweat gathering on his brow as he strained to listen, his mind unwilling to grasp the words but unable to turn away. And then, clear as day, he heard it. "Fu." The voice was unmistakable. He would recognize it anywhere. It was his father's voice, heavy with the sternness he had grown up fearing, yet now laced with something darker, something twisted by the grave. Fu shot up in bed, his eyes darting around the room, his breath coming in shallow, panicked gasps. "Father," he whispered, the word escaping him involuntarily, laden with disbelief and terror. But there was no response, only a thick silence, pressing down on him like a vice. He told himself it was just his imagination, a trick of the mind. After all, he was tired, haunted by thoughts of the wealth he had won at such a cost. But when he lay back down, pulling the blanket to his chin, as if it could shield him from the unknown, he felt it again, that sense of being watched. He turned to the corner of the room, and his blood ran cold. A figure stood there, cloaked in shadow, its form half hidden in the darkness but unmistakably human. Fu's eyes widened, his heart hammering so loudly he feared it would burst. The figure took a step forward, and as it moved into the dim moonlight, Fu felt the world close in around him. It was his father. Mr. Fong stood at the edge of the room, his face pale, his eyes dark hollows that seemed to bore into Fu's very soul. His expression was no longer that of the stern father Fu had known in life. It was twisted with grief and rage, a fury that seemed to seep from his very being, chilling the air and filling the room with a sense of doom that was almost tangible. Fu tried to scream, but no sound came out. He was paralyzed, trapped in his bed, unable to tear his gaze from the horrifying apparition. His father's lips moved, the voice thick and hoarse, as if dragged up from some unspeakable depth. "You betrayed me, Fu," the spirit whispered, each word falling like a stone into the silence, echoing in Fu's mind long after it was spoken. "You took everything, stole my life." And for what, Fu shook his head, squeezing his eyes shut, willing the vision to disappear. This couldn't be happening, it was impossible. But when he opened his eyes, the figure was closer, standing just a foot away, his cold, lifeless gaze fixed on Fu. "No," Fu choked, his voice barely a whisper. "It wasn't me. I didn't. but his father's spectre only seemed to grow more imposing, looming over him, filling the room with an icy chill that seeped into Fu's bones. The spirit's eyes burned with a fury that seemed to see through every lie, every excuse. "You let me die," Fu Mr. Fong continued, his voice gaining strength, each word filled with a pain that cut through Fu's defenses, leaving him raw and exposed. "You and that woman. You took everything I built, destroyed the life I gave you, and now you think you can escape." Fu's composure crumbled, his chest heaving as he struggled to breathe. He tried to stand, to move, but his legs felt like lead, weighed down by the terror coursing through him. The walls seemed to close in, the air thickening, suffocating him as the spirit's voice grew louder, more insistent. "There will be consequences," Mr. Fong said, his words laced with a dark promise. "You think death is the end? I am here, Fu. I am here, and I will not let you rest." Fu could feel his sanity slipping, his mind breaking under the weight of his father's rage. He wanted to scream, to beg for mercy, but the words caught in his throat, twisted into a strangled gasp. The spirit took another step forward, reaching out a cold, spectral hand that hovered inches from Fu's face, close enough for him to feel the chill radiating from it. "I will haunt you, my son, Mr. Fong whispered, his voice so soft yet so deadly that it sent shivers down Fu's spine. "I will be in every shadow, every silence. You will hear my voice in the dark, feel my presence in every empty room. I will be with you, Fu, until the day you join me in the cold earth." The figure faded, dissolving into the shadows, but the chill lingered, clinging to the walls, to the air, to Fu's very skin. He was left alone, trembling, his heart racing as he struggled to process what he had just witnessed. But deep down he knew with a certainty that gnawed at his soul that his father's spirit had come for vengeance. The nights that followed were filled with terror. Every creak of the floor, every gust of wind became a reminder, a whisper of the promise his father's spirit had made. Fu's once assured confidence shattered, replaced by an overwhelming dread that grew with each passing hour. He saw his father's face in the mirror, his hollow eyes staring back at him, accusing, condemning. He began to hear things, faint whispers echoing in the stillness, fragments of his father's voice seeping through the walls, haunting him in every corner of the house. When he walked through the halls, he felt a cold hand brush against his shoulder, a chill that lingered long after he had turned and found nothing there. His sleep was filled with nightmares, visions of his father's face twisted in agony, of spectral hands reaching for him, dragging him down into darkness. He would wake drenched in sweat, his heart pounding, only to hear that same whisper in his ear, his father's voice like a ghostly chant that refused to leave his mind. "You betrayed me, Fu. There will be consequences." The words haunted him, a curse that clung to his soul, filling him with a fear that he could not escape. His laughter turned hollow, his days empty, each moment a ticking clock counting down to some inevitable reckoning. He knew that his father's spirit would not rest until he had paid for his betrayal. And as he sat alone in the dark, his once proud, defiant heart was consumed by a single, horrifying thought. Death had not freed him from his father's wrath. It had only just begun. Part 5. The Curse of the Well. The days had grown unbearably heavy in the old Fong family estate, each hour feeling like an eternity for Lone. She could not shake the strange feeling that something was watching her, lurking in the shadows, waiting for her to slip. She tried to dismiss the gnawing sensation as paranoia, the residual guilt of her actions, but soon her confidence began to erode, slipping away like sand through her fingers. One humid afternoon, as she stood by the open kitchen window, a voice drifted through the stillness, so faint it could have been a trick of the wind. Yet the words were unmistakable, seeping into her mind like poison, cold and relentless. Lone, the voice was soft, but the bitterness behind it was unmistakable. She froze, her heart skipping a beat, her pulse roaring in her ears. Slowly she turned toward the sound, her gaze drawn, almost unwillingly, toward the family well at the far edge of the courtyard. There, surrounded by overgrown weeds and shadowed by a towering banyan tree, the well sat like a dark, brooding sentinel, ancient and silent. Its stone walls, covered in moss, seemed to pulse in the dim light, almost as if it breathed. The voice faded, leaving a strange, unsettling silence in its wake, but Lone could not tear her gaze away. The well had always been a fixture of the family estate, a place that held years of memories. But now, as Lone stared at it, she felt a suffocating dread twist her stomach, a fear that seemed to rise from the depths of her very soul. The voice. It had sounded just like Mr. Fong, and the thought made her shiver. Impossible, she muttered to herself, clutching her hands to steady their trembling. I'm just hearing things. But that night, as the house fell into silence, Lone's fear returned, stronger and more insistent. She lay in bed, her body tense, every creak of the old wooden beams making her pulse quicken. When she finally closed her eyes, exhaustion lulling her into a restless sleep, she dreamed of the well. In the dream she stood beside it, peering down into the dark water, her reflection staring back at her with hollow eyes. Slowly, the surface began to ripple, her reflection distorting, twisting, and then, from beneath the murky depths, Mr. Fong's face emerged, his eyes wide with rage, his mouth open in a silent scream. Lone gasped, stumbling back, but her feet were rooted to the ground, her body paralyzed with terror. Lone's voice whispered, echoing through the dream, filling her mind with a suffocating dread. You cannot escape me, she awoke with a start, her body drenched in cold sweat, her heart racing as she struggled to catch her breath. The darkness of the room pressed down on her, the shadows seeming to cling to her, winding around her like vines. She lay still, her hands clutching the bed sheets, as if they could shield her from the unseen horror lurking just beyond the walls. The days dragged on, but the haunting grew worse. Every time she walked past the well, she felt the prickling sensation of eyes on her back, a weight that seemed to press down on her shoulders, pulling her toward the dark depths. She began to hear whispers, faint and chilling, drifting up from the well's mouth like smoke. Lone, Lone, Lone. The sound twisted her insides with terror. She tried to ignore it, to focus on her daily tasks, but the whispers followed her, haunting her steps, filling her mind with an inescapable dread. She felt herself unraveling, her confidence shattered, leaving her vulnerable, exposed. One evening, as dusk settled over the courtyard, Lone found herself drawn to the well, unable to resist the dark pull that tugged at her soul. The air was thick with silence, the only sound her own labored breathing. As she approached the well's edge, she peered down into the depths, the darkness swirling beneath her, endless and suffocating. As she gazed into the black water, her reflection slowly appeared on the surface, but something was wrong. Her face looked twisted, hollow, her eyes empty, almost lifeless. And then, just beyond her reflection, she saw him, Mr. Fong, his face hovering beneath the water, his eyes fixed on her with a hatred so intense it felt like a physical blow. She stumbled back, a scream lodged in her throat, her mind reeling as she tried to process what she had seen. But the vision did not fade. His face remained in her mind, haunting her, filling her with a terror she could not escape. That night she barely slept, haunted by images of his ghostly face staring up at her from the dark water. The next morning she awoke to find herself trembling, her nerves frayed, her mind teetering on the edge of madness. She couldn't continue like this, couldn't bear the thought of his spirit lurking just beneath the surface, waiting to drag her down into the darkness. Desperation clawed at her heart, and she found herself drawn to the well once more, driven by a terrible compulsion to confront the presence that haunted her. She approached it slowly, her steps hesitant, her heart pounding as she leaned over the edge, her gaze fixed on the water below. "Why won't you leave me alone?" she whispered, her voice shaking with fear and frustration. For a moment there was only silence. Then, from the depths, a voice drifted up, soft and haunting, filled with a venomous rage that made her skin crawl. "Because you betrayed me," Lone's breath hitched, her heart racing as she backed away from the well, her mind screaming for her to run. But she couldn't move, her feet rooted to the spot, as the voice grew louder, filling the air around her, pressing down on her like a weight. "You thought you could take everything," Mr. Fong's voice hissed, each word a dagger that pierced her soul. "You thought I would let you get away with it. But you cannot escape the consequences of your sins, Lone. You are bound to this place, just as I am." Lone's chest tightened, a suffocating dread wrapping around her as the realization sank in. The well was cursed, a prison for Mr. Fong's vengeful spirit, and she was bound to it by the weight of her own betrayal. There would be no escape, no freedom from his wrath. She could feel it, the dark energy of the well seeping into her bones, entwining with her soul, binding her to this cursed ground. As she backed away, she felt a cold, spectral hand grip her shoulder, its touch searing into her skin like ice. She gasped, whirling around, but there was nothing there, only the empty darkness, thick and suffocating. Yet she could still feel his presence pressing in on her, filling her with a terror so profound that it nearly shattered her mind. From that day on, Lone could no longer bring herself to go near the well, but it didn't matter. The hauntings followed her, seeping into every corner of the house, filling her nights with nightmares and her days with a suffocating fear that left her a shadow of her former self. The whispers grew louder, filling the silence with Mr. Feng's vengeful voice, a constant reminder of the curse that bound her to his wrath. And every night as she lay in bed, unable to close her eyes without seeing his face, she heard him calling to her, his voice drifting up from the darkness of the well, a dark, inescapable reminder of the price she would pay. Lone, Lone, you are mine, just as I am yours, forever. Part 6. The Spiritual Battle. Fu and Lone had grown desperate. The nights in their once grand estate were now filled with terror and dread, every shadow seeming to whisper, every draught of air chilling them to the bone. The relentless hauntings, the ceaseless presence of Mr. Feng's spirit, silent yet ever watchful, had pushed them both to the edge. They were barely sleeping, and their nerves were frayed to the point of breaking. It was only a matter of time before the horror of it all consumed them entirely. Lone, whose confidence had once been unshakable, now moved through the house with wide, fearful eyes, flinching at the slightest noise. Fu, who had once held his father in contempt, was reduced to a fearful shadow, haunted by the weight of his father's last words, the accusatory stare that seemed to follow him through every room, every corridor. They needed a way out, anything that could silence the spirit and let them finally live in peace. It was Lone who suggested the sorcerer, a man whose reputation as a master of dark arts was whispered throughout the nearby villages. Rumor had it that he could trap restless spirits, bind them to places where they could no longer torment the living. Fu was hesitant. The idea of meddling with such dark forces made his skin crawl. But Lone's desperation was stronger than her fear, and her insistence wore him down. They had no other options left. And so, under the cover of night, they ventured into the dense forest on the outskirts of the village, where the sorcerer was said to live. The path was dark and winding, and the deeper they went, the colder the air grew, as if even the forest knew the dark purpose of their journey. By the time they reached the sorcerer's hut, a ramshackle structure hidden in the thick undergrowth, both were trembling, their breaths shallow, their hearts pounding. The sorcerer, a gaunt, ancient man with hollow eyes that seemed to see straight through them, greeted them with an unsettling smile. His fingers, long and bony, were adorned with strange rings, and his voice was little more than a rasp, as if worn thin by years of whispering curses and incantations. "You seek to silence a spirit, I presume," he said, his voice dripping with a dark amusement that made Lone shiver. "The spirit of one." Wronged Fu and Lone exchanged a glance, their faces pale, before Fu stepped forward, swallowing hard. "Yes, my father. His spirit, it won't leave us alone. He haunts us, torments us." His voice trailed off, but the sorcerer's eyes glinted with understanding. "A vengeful spirit," the sorcerer murmured, nodding slowly. "They are the most difficult to silence. Once a soul has been betrayed, it clings to the living. Bound by the need for vengeance, his gaze sharpened, turning to Lone. "You know this well, don't you?" Lone flinched, her fingers digging into her arms as she looked away, guilt twisting her features. We only did what was necessary," she muttered, her voice barely audible. But the sorcerer merely chuckled, a dark, mirthless sound that sent a chill through the air. "There is no necessary to the dead, my dear." Only just as he turned to a shelf, pulling down jars filled with strange powders and herbs. "If you wish to bind this spirit, to trap it in the place of its torment, it will require a powerful ritual, a sacrifice of sorts." Fu and Lone nodded, though their stomachs twisted at the thought. They had come too far to turn back now. The sorcerer gestured for them to follow him outside, and they made their way to the well, the air thick with the weight of Mr. Feng's presence silent but suffocating. The sorcerer arranged the jars in a circle around the well, his movements slow and deliberate, his voice rising in a strange guttural chant that seemed to thicken the very air. Fu and Lone watched in tense silence, their breaths shallow as the sorcerer sprinkled powders and herbs around the well, his voice growing louder, more forceful. The wind picked up, swirling around them, and the shadows seemed to gather, pressing in close. The sorcerer raised his hands, his voice filling the night with an eerie power. Fu and Lone could feel it, the dark energy gathering, swirling around the well, filling the air with a cold that cut through them like a blade. Spirit of Feng, the sorcerer intoned, his voice resonating with a strange, unnatural force. I bind you to this place. I command you to remain here, to leave the living in peace for a moment. There was silence, and a strange, almost peaceful stillness settled over the well. Fu and Lone exchanged a glance, hope flickering in their eyes. Perhaps finally would be free. But then, from the depths of the well, a low, rumbling sound began to rise, like the growl of an animal. The air grew colder, and the darkness deepened, pressing in on them. The rumbling grew louder, more intense, filling the night with a sound that seemed to come from the depths of hell itself. The sorcerer's charm faltered, his expression twisting with fear as he realized that something had gone terribly, terribly wrong. From within the well a voice echoed, distorted and twisted with fury, each word dripping with a hatred so deep that it seemed to burn the very air. You think you can bind me? Mr. Feng's voice thundered, filling the courtyard with a sound that made Lone's knees buckle. You think you can silence the dead? The ground shook, the air growing so cold that frost began to gather on the stones around the well. Lone gasped, her breath coming in desperate, terrified gasps as she clutched at Fu, her eyes wide with horror. This was no longer just a haunting. They had awoken something far darker, something far more powerful than they could have imagined. The sorcerer stumbled back, his face pale, his hands trembling, as he tried to regain control of the ritual. Be still, spirit, I command you. But before he could finish, a dark, writhing shadow burst from the well, filling the air with an overwhelming force. It took the shape of Mr. Feng, his face twisted with rage, his eyes burning with a hatred so fierce that it seemed to pierce through their souls. He will never escape me, he roared, his voice like thunder, each word vibrating with the power of the grave. Not you, Fu, not you. You thought death would silence me. You thought betrayal could be hidden in shadows. Fu felt his legs give way, and he dropped to the ground, his entire body trembling as he stared at the vengeful spirit of his father. The full weight of his actions crashed over him, a tidal wave of guilt and terror that left him gasping for breath. The sorcerer stumbled forward, desperation in his eyes. Please, spirit, be at peace. I only wish to bind you, to give you rest. Mr. Feng's spirit sneered, his form flickering in and out of sight as he turned to the sorcerer. There will be no rest until justice is served. The sorcerer staggered back, his face contorted with horror. He turned to Fu and Lone, his voice shaking. There is nothing I can do, he whispered, his voice filled with dread. This spirit, it will not be bound. It is too strong, its fury too great. You have condemned yourselves. Lone let out a strangled cry, clutching at her chest as the reality of their fate crashed down upon her. They had tried to silence the spirit, to bury the past, but it had only made things worse. Mr. Feng's wrath had been unleashed, and there was no force on earth that could stop it now. As the spirit's laughter filled the air, a cold, mocking sound that echoed through the night, Fu and Lone stumbled back, their minds shattered, their souls burdened with a terror that they could never escape. They had thought they could evade justice, could bury the sins of their past. But in the end there was no escape, no hiding from the vengeance of the dead. Bound to the well, Mr. Feng's spirit would haunt them, torment them, until they faced the full weight of his wrath. And as they fled, their hearts pounding with terror, they knew deep down that their punishment had only just begun. Part 7. The Son's Demise. The night settled over the estate like a heavy shroud, dense and stifling, as though every shadow bore witness to unspeakable secrets. Fu, exhausted from endless nights haunted by whispers and shadows, finally collapsed into bed, hoping for a brief respite from the torment. His mind was frayed, his once confident demeanor shattered by weeks of fear and dread. The estate felt less like a home and more like a prison, each room filled with the accusing silence of his father's unrelenting spirit. He tried to sleep, telling himself that he would be safe in the light of dawn. As his eyes closed, a fragile hope flickered in his chest. But as he drifted into slumber, the darkness around him thickened, pressing down, filling the air with an unnatural chill that made his breath catch even in his sleep. It started as a faint whisper, an echo of his father's voice, soft yet biting. Fu, You cannot escape me." The words cut through the silence like a blade, pulling him from the edges of sleep into a strange, half-conscious state. He could feel a presence in the room, an oppressive weight settling over him. Yet when he opened his eyes, there was nothing there, just shadows dancing in the moonlight. He tried to sit up, but a force held him down, as if invisible hands pressed against his chest, pinning him in place. Panic surged through him as he struggled, his breaths coming in short, desperate gasps. A chill spread through his body, icy fingers crawling up his neck, wrapping around his throat. He could feel the pressure growing, his breath hitching as he fought against it, but the grip only tightened, relentless and unyielding. In his mind, his father's face appeared, distorted by an anger that seemed to burn with a darkness from beyond the grave. Mr. Feng's eyes were hollow, yet they bored into Fu's soul, filled with a fury that left no room for mercy. His lips moved, and though no sound escaped, Fu could read the accusation in his father's gaze, the silent condemnation that spoke louder than words ever could. "You betrayed me." The silent voice seemed to say, reverberating in his mind, filling every crevice of his being with a guilt he could not escape. "You betrayed your own blood, your own family." Fu's mind screamed in terror as he clawed at his neck, desperate to loosen the unseen grip that was crushing the life out of him. His nails dug into his skin, leaving scratches and bruises, but it was no use. The invisible hands held him fast, tightening with a cruelty that seemed to drain the very life from him. His vision began to blur, the room around him fading into darkness. He could feel his heartbeat slowing, each beat weaker than the last, his strength ebbing away as the pressure continued to build, crushing him from the inside out. In his final moments, as his consciousness slipped away, he saw a figure standing at the foot of his bed. It was his mother, her face a mask of sorrow and regret, her eyes filled with the grief and disappointment that had haunted her ever since Mr. Feng's death. She said nothing, but her gaze was enough, her silent condemnation piercing his soul like a dagger. She didn't need to speak, her eyes conveyed everything, the unbearable weight of her disappointment, the pain of betrayal, the tragedy of a son who had lost himself to greed. As the last breath left his body, Fu's mind filled with a single, desperate thought. "Forgive me, please," but it was too late. His father's spirit had exacted its vengeance, and with one final, crushing squeeze, the grip around Fu's throat tightened, snuffing out his life. His body went limp, his face frozen in terror, his eyes wide with the horror of his last moments. The room fell silent, the darkness swallowing him whole, leaving nothing but a cold, empty shell where he had once been. Lone was awakened by a strange, unsettling stillness in the air, a silence so profound that it felt as though the world itself was holding its breath. She turned over in bed, reaching for Fu, but her hand found only cold, empty sheets. Her heart skipped a beat, dread settling in her stomach as she sat up, her eyes scanning the room in the dim light. "Fu," she called softly, her voice trembling, but there was no response. She stood, her footsteps tentative as she made her way to his room. The door creaked open, and the sight that greeted her made her blood run cold. Fu lay sprawled on the bed, his face contorted in a frozen mask of terror, his eyes wide, his mouth slightly open as though he had tried to scream. Bruises marred his neck, dark marks left by the invisible force that had taken his life, a silent testament to the vengeance that had been exacted. Lone stumbled back, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle the scream that threatened to escape. Her mind reeled, unable to process the horror before her. Fu was dead, her partner, her accomplice, the man with whom she had planned everything. He was gone, taken in the night by the spirit they had thought they could silence. A small part of her wanted to believe it was a nightmare, that she would wake up and find him alive beside her, but deep down she knew the truth. Mr. Feng's spirit had come for his son, exacting the vengeance that death had not been able to prevent. And now she was alone, left to face the wrath of a spirit that would not rest until justice had been served. But as she stood there, trembling with shock and fear, a strange sense of relief washed over her. "It's over," she thought, her mind grasping for comfort amidst the horror. The spirit wanted Fu. He's taken his revenge. "I'm safe now." She backed away from the room, closing the door as if shutting it would somehow keep the terror at bay. She forced herself to breathe, to calm her racing heart. "It's over," she told herself again, her mind clinging to the thought. "I am safe," but as she turned to leave, she felt a chill settle over her, a coldness that seemed to seep into her bones, wrapping around her like a shadow. In the silence, he could hear a faint whisper, a soft, mocking laugh that echoed through the corridors, filling the empty halls with a sense of foreboding that made her blood run cold. Lone, the voice whispered, its tone dark and filled with a promise that sent a shiver down her spine. "You're next." The weight of her own guilt crashed over her, a suffocating reminder that she was not safe, that Mr. Fong's vengeance was not yet complete. She could feel his presence lurking, watching, waiting. Fu's death had not been the end. It was only the beginning, a prelude to the horror that awaited her, the price she would pay for the betrayal she could never escape. As the whispers grew louder, filling the air with the promise of retribution, Lone realized the truth, a truth that shattered her fragile hope and left her trembling in the darkness. The nightmare was far from over. It had only just begun. Part 8. The Final Retribution. In the vast silence of the house, Lone felt a dread unlike anything she'd ever known. It was an emptiness that seemed to pulse with unseen malice, a darkness that clung to every corner, every wall, and every step she took. With Fu gone, the estate had become a prison, a labyrinth of shadows that seemed to shift and breathe around her. She could feel it, the oppressive weight of something watching her, lurking just beyond sight, waiting for the right moment to strike. She wandered through the dimly lit corridors, her footsteps muffled by the heavy silence, her heart pounding as she clung to the hope that, with Fu's death, the hauntings would cease. But as each night passed, her hope dwindled, giving way to a terror that only deepened with every hour. The shadows grew darker, and the silence more menacing, as if the house itself was conspiring against her. One evening, as she sat by the dying embers of the fire, a sudden chill washed over her, sending a shiver down her spine. The room grew cold, the warmth of the fire unable to penetrate the icy fog that seemed to settle over her. She clutched her shawl tighter, glancing around, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. Then, from the corner of her eye, she saw a figure. Her heart froze as she turned, her eyes widening in horror. Standing in the doorway, half hidden by shadow, was Mrs. Lin, her mother-in-law. Her face was pale and sorrowful, her eyes hollow and filled with an unbearable sadness. She looked more gaunt than Lone had ever remembered, as if the spirit world had stripped her of everything except the pain of betrayal and loss. Lone's voice caught in her throat, her mind reeling with disbelief. No, it can't be. You're dead," she stammered, backing away, her hands trembling as she tried to shield herself from the apparition before her. But Mrs. Lin's ghost took a step forward, her gaze fixed on Lone with an intensity that cut through the darkness. She raised a single skeletal hand and pointed, her finger extended toward the window, her expression unchanging, as if her very soul were bound to the gesture. Lone followed the direction of her finger, her eyes drawn to the well at the edge of the courtyard, looming in the moonlight like a dark, open maw. She felt her stomach twist with dread, a chill creeping up her spine as Mrs. Lin's spirit stared at her, silent but demanding. The message was clear, the well. "No," Lone whispered, shaking her head as she backed away, horror flooding her mind. "No, please. I didn't mean, I never wanted. Please forgive me." But Mrs. Lin's expression remained unchanged, her finger unwavering as it pointed toward the well, a dark determination etched into every line of her face. Lone felt the pull, a force she couldn't see, but one that wrapped around her, pressing her forward, urging her toward the well. She tried to resist, planting her feet firmly on the ground, but her body seemed to betray her, her legs moving of their own accord, dragging her step by step toward the open courtyard. She felt her heart pounding, her breath coming in short, desperate gasps, as she struggled against the invisible force, her mind screaming in terror. "No, stop, please," she cried, clawing at the walls, at the floor, at anything she could reach, but it was no use. The force grew stronger, pulling her forward, relentless and unyielding. As she stumbled into the courtyard, the well loomed before her, dark and foreboding, its depths shrouded in shadow. The air around it was thick with a suffocating cold, a chill that seemed to seep into her very bones, filling her with a dread so intense that it left her shaking. And then she saw it. In the dark water at the bottom of the well, a face stared up at her, a face twisted in anger and sorrow, a face that bore the unmistakable features of Mr. Fong. His eyes glinted with a dark fury, his mouth twisted into a smile, his gaze fixed on her with a hatred that seemed to burn through the darkness, filling her with an inescapable terror. Lone's scream tore through the silence as she stumbled back, her legs giving way beneath her. She tried to crawl away, her hands scraping against the cold, damp stone, but the force grew stronger, pulling her inexorably toward the edge of the well. No, please, she sobbed, her voice hoarse with desperation. I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. Please forgive me, but the spirit showed no mercy. She felt a cold, spectral hand close around her ankle, an icy grip that sent a shock of terror through her, freezing her blood. She kicked and struggled, her hands clawing at the stones, but the grip tightened, pulling her closer and closer to the edge. Her fingers scraped against the stone, leaving bloody smears as she fought, her heart pounding with a terror so intense that she thought it would tear her apart. But the pull was relentless, dragging her inch by inch toward the dark mouth of the well. As she reached the edge, she looked down, her eyes wide with horror as Mr. Feng's face rose to meet her, his gaze filled with a vengeance that knew no bounds. She could feel his anger, his hatred, his pain, all pouring from his eyes, filling her with a terror so profound that it left her paralyzed. The spectral hands closed around her wrists, her ankles cold and merciless, pulling her forward, tilting her over the edge. She could see the dark water below, swirling with shadows, waiting to swallow her whole. No, please, she screamed, her voice echoing through the night, but there was no one to hear her, no one to save her. As she plunged into the darkness, the cold water closed over her, suffocating her, wrapping around her like a shroud. She felt the hands pulling her down, deeper and deeper, the weight of the water pressing against her, filling her lungs, drowning her screams. The last thing she saw was the face of Mr. Feng, his eyes filled with a dark satisfaction, his lips curling into a smile as he watched her sink into the depths, her body dragged down by the weight of her own sins. And then there was only darkness. The well returned to silence, the water still and calm, the surface undisturbed. The night grew quiet once more, the shadows settling around the estate like a cloak, hiding the horror that had unfolded within its walls. But beneath the surface, in the dark, murky depths of the well, Lone's spirit joined the restless souls that had come before her, bound forever to the curse she had brought upon herself. The house remained empty and silent, haunted by the echoes of betrayal and revenge, a monument to the tragedy that had taken place within its walls. The darkness held its secrets close, leaving the estate as a warning, a place where the dead would forever keep their vigil, waiting for those who dared to betray the blood that bound them. Part 9. The Legend of the Well. After Lone's sudden and inexplicable disappearance, whispers began to stir throughout the village. People spoke in hushed tones, passing fragments of the tale like secrets too terrible to say aloud. It wasn't long before the stories took on a life of their own, each retelling weaving in new details, new horrors. And at the heart of every version, every warning, stood the well, a dark, silent testament to the chilling fate of the Feng family. Some of the villagers claimed to have heard strange sounds emanating from the estate on quiet nights, low moans that seemed to rise from deep within the earth. It was said that if you dared to venture close enough, you could hear a faint, pleading voice calling out from the depths of the well, a voice choked with fear, begging for forgiveness. But it was the more vivid accounts, the ones that spoke of ghostly figures and spectral faces, that struck fear into the villagers' hearts. One night, a young farmhand named Kian had ventured too close to the well after dark, drawn by curiosity and a chilling sense of foreboding that he couldn't resist. He would never forget the sight that greeted him. As he peered over the edge, straining to see through the black water below, a face appeared just beneath the surface, a woman's face, pale and ghostly, her eyes wide with terror. Her lips moved silently, forming words he couldn't hear, her gaze filled with a desperation that sent a chill down his spine. He had stumbled back in horror, running all the way home, too frightened even to look over his shoulder. Word of Kian's encounter spread quickly, fueling the growing legend. Soon, others claimed to have seen similar apparitions, shadowy figures gliding along the edge of the well, faces flickering in the water, their hollow eyes fixed on anyone who dared to come close. They said these ghostly faces appeared only on moonless nights when the air was still and the silence of the night pressed in like a shroud. Old women would sit by their fires, warning the children never to stray too close to the Feng estate, lest the spirits catch them and drag them into the depths, just as they had dragged Lone. They told the story of Mr. Fong, a man of great honor and wealth, who had been betrayed by his only son and his cunning daughter-in-law. They spoke of the sorcerer's failed ritual, the final act of revenge, and the wrathful spirits that still haunted the grounds. Once you betray blood, it will haunt you forever, the elders would say, their eyes shadowed with memories and fears. The well doesn't forgive, and neither do the spirits within. For many, the well became a symbol of caution, a reminder of the weight of betrayal and the price of greed. Even those who didn't believe in ghosts would find themselves lowering their voices as they passed by, averting their eyes from the estate, as if to avoid drawing the attention of the spirits within. But some were bolder. It became a test of bravery among the village youth, a rite of passage for those foolhardy enough to seek out the truth of the cursed well. They would gather in small groups under the cover of darkness, daring each other to approach the well, to peer into its depths and call out to the spirits. Few had the courage to go near it alone, for the rumors had become too real, too terrifying. One night, a boy named Ta, determined to prove his bravery, ventured out alone. As he neared the well, the hairs on his neck prickled, and a chill swept over him, though there was no wind. The silence was so absolute it felt as if the world itself was holding its breath, watching, waiting. With trembling hands, he leaned over the edge and stared into the inky blackness below, his heart pounding as he listened to the silence. But then, just as he was about to turn away, the surface of the water rippled, distorting his reflection. But he froze, fear gripping him as he saw a pale, ghostly face emerge from the depths, her eyes wide, hollow, filled with a sorrow and hatred that reached out to him, chilling him to the bone. She was there, her mouth moving soundlessly, pleading for release, her gaze a mixture of fury and despair. Tan stumbled back, his scream catching in his throat, as he tore himself away, running as fast as his legs could carry him, vowing never to return. The villagers, too, began to keep their distance. Farmers refused to tend fields near the Fong estate, and children no longer played in the shadows of its walls. The house, once grand and filled with life, decayed into ruin, overtaken by weeds and creeping vines, its windows shattered, its halls empty. And the well, once a simple structure in the courtyard, became a place of dread, a monument to the tragedy that had unfolded, to the spirits that still lingered, bound to the earth by the chains of betrayal and vengeance. The tale of the cursed well spread far beyond the village, passing from mouth to mouth, growing darker with each retelling. Travelers would come through, drawn by the story, only to leave with hurried steps, their faces pale, their hearts heavy with the lingering chill of the estate. The years passed, and the story became legend, a warning that echoed through generations. It became a tale parents told their children, a story whispered over firesides, a ghostly reminder of the consequences of deceit, of betrayal, of the darkness that could consume even the wealthiest and most respected. And as time went on, the well remained silent and brooding, its depths untouched, undisturbed, yet those who dared to linger too close would swear that, even in the daylight, they could feel eyes upon them, watching from the darkness below, waiting. The water was always still, its surface dark and impenetrable, hiding whatever lay beneath. But every now and then, on the stillest of nights, a soft whisper could be heard, drifting up from the depths, faint but unmistakable, a voice filled with sorrow and wrath, forever bound to the place of its suffering. "Forgive me," the voice would murmur, echoing through the stillness. "Please, forgive me." And those who heard it would walk away with heavy hearts, feeling the weight of the warning that the well offered, a reminder of the doom that awaited those who betrayed their blood, their family, their legacy. No one dared disturb the well, for it had become more than just a place. It was a symbol, a reminder of the darkness that lay hidden within human hearts, a darkness that could never be silenced, never forgiven. The Fong estate became a desolate monument to that haunting tale, a place avoided, respected, and feared by all who knew the story. And in the dead of night, when the world was still and silent, the villagers would huddle close, hoping the whispers would not find them, praying that the well would remain silent, and that the spirits within would rest, undisturbed, for another night.